You're not her mother. Charles Wentworth's voice cuts like a whip, his eyes blazing as he towers over LaTanya Brooks, a 34-year-old black maid, her arms cradling Emma, an 8-year-old orphan trembling against her chest. LaTanya's jaw clenches, teeth grinding, her knees digging into the cold Atlanta mansion floor, unyielding despite Charles's venom. His cruel words, "You're nothing here," strike, but her defiance burns brighter, a fire that sparks a heartwarming story of justice. This Maid song will unravel a scandal, shaking a tycoon's world and rebuilding a community. Her courage proves family isn't blood, it's who stays through the storm. Hit that subscribe button and share where you're watching from, what time it is, LaTanya's fight, Emma's hope, and a truth that flips everything away. Stick around. This tale of resilience will leave you speechless. LaTanya's fingers tightened around Emma, the girl's small frame shaking, her whimpers muffled against LaTanya's worn apron. "She's scared, Mr. Wentworth," LaTanya said, her voice low, steady, a blade wrapped in velvet. "She needs someone to hold her." Charles's face twisted, his lips curling into a sneer. "Hold her? You're paid to scrub floors, not play savior. Know your place." His words dripped venom, each syllable a jab at her skin. Black, working class, invisible. Emma's tiny hands clutched LaTanya's blouse, nails digging in like anchors. "Tanya, don't go," the girl whispered, her voice a fragile thread. LaTanya's heart thudded, a drumbeat of defiance, but she kept her eyes locked on Charles. "She's not a chore to check off," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "She's a child." Charles barked a laugh, cold and jagged. "A child you're not fit to touch. You're nothing here." He stepped forward, his hands shooting out to yank Emma from LaTanya's arms. The girl shrieked, a piercing wail that echoed off the high ceilings, her small body thrashing in his grip. LaTanya's chest tightened, a coil ready to snap, but she forced her hands to stay still. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You're scaring her," LaTanya said, her voice a low growl, each word deliberate. Charles ignored her, his face red, struggling to hold Emma's flailing limbs. "Quiet, Emma," he snapped, but the girl's cries only grew louder, a storm of fear. LaTanya stood, her knees aching from the cold floor, her eyes burning with restrained fury. "You don't know her," she said, stepping closer, her presence a quiet challenge. "You don't know what she needs." Charles spun on her, his finger jabbing the air an inch from her face. "Don't lecture me in my own house," he roared, cutting her off before she could respond. "You're replaceable. One word, and you're gone." LaTanya's lips pressed into a thin line, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to scream, to shove his words back down his throat, but Emma's sobs anchored her. She wouldn't let this man's cruelty break her resolve. "Fire me," she said, her voice deadly calm. "But you can't fire what Emma feels." Charles's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his face, but he doubled down, his voice a hiss. "Get out of my sight." LaTanya's fist balled at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She turned to Emma, still crying in Charles's arms, and whispered, "I'm here, baby girl, always." Then she walked out, her footsteps deliberate, each one a silent vow to return. The door clicked shut behind her, but Emma's cries followed, sharp as shards in her chest. Charles stood frozen, Emma's screams a relentless echo of his mistake. LaTanya's words hung in the air, a prophecy he couldn't shake. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, a bigger one was brewing. LaTanya Brooks stood rigid in the doorway, Emma's desperate wails slicing into her like shards of glass. Charles Wentworth's venomous words, "You're nothing here," burned in her skull, each one a fresh wound. Her fists balled so tight her nails carved half-moons into her palms, the sting anchoring her against the fury threatening to erupt. Emma's cries sharpened, a raw, heart-wrenching plea. "Tanya, don't leave!" The girl's small hands clawed at the air, reaching for her sobs a storm of fear and need. LaTanya's chest tightened, her pulse hammering, but her eyes stayed locked on Charles, unyielding, a silent challenge. "Silence her!" Charles barked, his voice a lash, his face twisted with irritation as he struggled to hold Emma's thrashing frame. "Stop it, Emma!" he snapped, his grip awkward, his knuckles white. The girl's screams only grew, a wild, piercing sound that cut through the mansion's sterile air. Latonia's jaw clenched, her teeth grinding until her temples throbbed. She wanted to lunge, to rip Emma from his arms, to shield her from his coldness. But she knew his kind. Men like Charles thrived on breaking people like her. She wouldn't give him that. "You're scaring her," Latonia said, her voice low, sharp, each word a honed blade. "She needs someone who cares, not commands." Charles's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Don't you dare lecture me," he spat, cutting her off, his finger stabbing the air an inch from her face. "You're a maid. You don't speak unless I say so." His words were a slap steeped in disdain. Black, working class, invisible. Latonia's lips pressed into a hard line, her heartbeat a war drum in her ears. Every instinct screamed to fight back, to hurl his cruelty back in his face. But Emma's sobs held her steady. She wouldn't let this man see her crack. She stepped forward, her gaze burning, a quiet fire that refused to flicker out. "Emma knows who holds her when the world feels too big," she said, her voice steady, cutting like steel. "You can fire me, Mr. Wentworth, but you can't erase what she feels." Charles's sneer wavered, a shadow of doubt flickering in his eyes, but he doubled down, his voice a hiss. "Get out, or I'll make sure you never work again." Latonia's fingers twitched, aching to reach for Emma, but she held herself still. She knelt, her eyes softening as they met the girl's tear-soaked face. "I'm still here, baby girl," she whispered, her voice a lifeline, soft but unbreakable. "You keep my song in your heart, okay?" Emma's sobs hitched, her small head nodding, her trust a fragile thread tying them together. Latonia rose, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted like a warrior. She turned, her footsteps deliberate, each one a defiance carved into the silence. Charles's words pressed against her back, heavy as iron, but she carried them like a shield, her resolve of fire burning brighter with every step. At the door she paused, her hand gripping the frame, and threw a final glance at Charles. "You'll feel this one day," she said, her voice a low, prophetic vow. "Not my pain, but hers." The door clicked shut, muffling Emma's cries but not silencing them. Latonia stood in the hallway, her breath catching, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from a fire that refused to die. Emma's voice echoed in her mind, small and broken, calling her name. Her teeth ground together, a silent oath. She'd be back. She'd faced worse, sneers, slurs, doors slammed in her face. This was just another fight, and Latonia Brooks didn't lose fights that mattered. Behind the door, Charles stood rooted, Emma's screams a relentless assault on his pride. Her small body fought his grip, her cries a mirror of his misstep. Latonia's words lingered, sharp as a blade. "You'll feel this one day." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of her absence. He'd pushed her out, but the void she left was louder than the storm outside, a warning he couldn't ignore. Charles Wentworth stood frozen, Emma's relentless wails hammering his ears like a judge's gavel. The 6-year-old orphan thrashed in his arms, her small fists pounding his chest, her face red and streaked with tears. "Tanya, I want Tanya," she screamed, her voice a raw blade cutting through his pride. Latonia Brooks' parting words, "You'll feel this one day," clawed at his mind, each syllable a splinter under his skin. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped Emma, trying to force her still. But her cries only sharpened, a chaotic storm he couldn't control. His pulse raced, a flicker of panic sparking in his chest. He'd won the fight, hadn't he? He'd put the maid in her place. So why did the room feel like it was closing in? "Emma, stop!" Charles snapped, his voice a jagged edge. But the girl's sobs grew wilder, her body twisting like she could break free and run after Latonia. His hands fumbled, clumsy, unpracticed, as he tried to mimic Latonia's gentle hold. Nothing worked. His throat tightened, a bitter taste rising. He'd never held a child like this, never needed to. His life was boardrooms, contracts, power, things he could command. But Emma's screams defied him, each one a mirror reflecting his failure. He set her down on the plush armchair, her small frame sinking into the cushions, still sobbing. His eyes caught a glint of something on the floor, a handkerchief worn but neatly folded, embroidered with a simple Elma Latonia's. His fingers hesitated, then snatched it up, the fabric soft against his calloused hands. Next to it, half hidden under the chair, was a crumpled piece of paper, childishly scrawled with crayon. A stick figure with dark hair holding hands with a smaller one, labeled Tanya and Me. Emma's drawing. Charles's stomach twisted, a sharp pang he couldn't name. He stared at the image, the lines shaky but deliberate, a testament to a bond he'd just severed. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice low, almost lost under Emma's cries. He knelt, awkward, trying to pat her back, but she flinched, curling into herself, her sobs hitching. "It's okay," he said, the words hollow, unconvincing even to himself. Emma's eyes, wet and wide, searched the room for Latonia, not him. The realization hit like a fist. This child didn't trust him. She trusted her, the maid he'd just banished. His chest tightened, a crack forming in his armor of arrogance. Latonia's voice echoed, "You'll feel this one day, not my pain, but hers." He shook his head, trying to shove the thought away, but it clung like damp cloth. His gaze fell to the floor again, catching a small scrap of paper near the handkerchief, missed in his haste. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the rough edge. Scrawled in hurried ink were the words, "Qui tu tien, Kiem tra Northridge, 4M. His brow furrowed, the foreign script jarring, but the numbers and name, Northridge, stuck out. It wasn't Latonia's handwriting. Too angular, too rushed. Had it fallen from her pocket? His mind raced, suspicion warring with confusion. Northridge Consulting was a name he'd heard in board meetings, tied to the family's charity fund. But 4M? That wasn't right. He stuffed the note into his pocket, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from a dawning unease. Charles stood, Emma's cries softer now, exhausted, but still piercing. He paced, his polished shoes clicking on the marble, each step a futile attempt to outrun the weight settling in his gut. Latonia's absence was louder than Emma's screams, a void he couldn't fill. He dismissed her, humiliated her, but the handkerchief, the drawing, the note, they were evidence of something he'd misjudged. His fingers brushed the note in his pocket, the paper crinkling, a whisper of secrets he didn't yet understand. He looked at Emma, curled up, clutching eosinophilic esophagitis, still whispering Tanya between hiccups. His throat closed, a lump forming. He'd been wrong, not just about Latonia, but about what it meant to be needed. He scooped Emma up again, her small body limp, her face buried in his shoulder, but her quiet whimpers screamed louder than words. Latonia's prophecy burned. "You'll feel this one day." That day was now, and the weight of it was heavier than he'd ever imagined. He carried Emma to her room, the note in his pocket a ticking bomb, waiting to explode. "I was wrong," Charles Wentworth's voice cracked like a gunshot in the cramped Harlem apartment. His fist clenched against the peeling doorframe. Latonia Brooks froze, her hand gripping a spatula, the sizzle of eggs on the stove hissing in the silence. Her dark eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade, cutting through his tailored suit in polished arrogance. At 34, she stood tall in her worn apron, her jaw tight, her pulse pounding in her temples. Her teenage daughter, Maya, hovered behind her, eyeing Charles with suspicion, a silent guard. Emma's cries from last night, sharp, desperate, still echoed in Charles's ears, her scribbled drawing and Latonia's handkerchief burning a hole in his pocket. "I shouldn't have said those things," he said, his voice low, raw. "Come back. Emma needs you." Latonia's lips pressed into a hard line, her fingers tightening around the spatula until her knuckles whitened. "You don't get to barge in here and rewrite your shame," she snapped, her words a whip. "You called me nothing. You think words like that just vanish?" Charles flinched, his shoulders hunching, but he didn't back down. "I was angry," he said, his voice tight. "I didn't see—" "You didn't see her," Latonia cut in, her voice a low growl, slicing his excuse in half. "Emma was shaking, And you tore her from me like she was property. Her eyes burned, a fire stoked by years of swallowed slurs and sidelong glances. She turned back to the stove, flipping the eggs with a sharp flick. The motion a defiance. Maya stepped closer, her arms crossed, her gaze daring Charles to say more. He swallowed, his throat dry, the weight of Latanya's words pinning him like a blade to his chest. I'm trying to fix this, Charles said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Emma hasn't stopped crying since you left. Latonya's hand stilled, the spatula hovering, her breath catching. Emma's face, tear-streaked, searching for her, flashed in her mind. Her heart thudded, a drumbeat of duty, but she wouldn't let Charles see it. You think an apology erases what you did? She said, turning to face him, her eyes locked on his. You humiliated me. You scared her. And now you're here because you can't handle her tears? Charles's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his side. I'm here because I was wrong, he said, each word forced, like pulling teeth. I saw her drawing. Your handkerchief. I know she needs you. Latanya's gaze flickered, a crack in her armor, but she held firm. She needs more than me, she said, her voice steady, cutting. She needs someone who sees her as a person, not a problem. Can you do that, Mr. Wentworth? He opened his mouth, but no words came. His hand slipped into his pocket, brushing the crumpled note, Qui tu tien, Kiemtra Northridge, 4M. Its mystery gnawing at him. That note, he said, his voice low, hesitant, the one that fell from your pocket. What does it mean? Latonya's brow furrowed, her fingers tightening on the spatula again. I don't know any note, she said, her tone sharp, suspicious. You're fishing for excuses to keep me in my place. No, Charles said quickly, his hand rising, palm out. It's about Northridge, the charity fund. 4 million. It's not right. Latonya's eyes narrowed, searching his face for a lie. She didn't trust him, not after last night. But the mention of the charity fund, a name she'd overheard in the mansion's hushed corridors, sent a jolt through her. If it's not right, that's your mess, not mine, she said, her voice cold. I'm not your maid anymore. Charles's face fell, a shadow of defeat crossing his eyes. I'm asking you to come back, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For Emma. Name your terms. Latonya's chest tightened, her resolve wavering at the thought of Emma's small hands reaching for her. She set the spatula down, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. Respect, she said, her voice a blade. You treat me like a person, not a shadow. And you fix that cold room for Emma. She deserves better than your neglect. He nodded, his jaw tight, a flicker of something, guilt maybe, flashing in his eyes. Done, he said, the word heavy, a contract sealed in shame. Latanya turned back to the stove, her hands steady now, but her mind racing. The note, Northridge, the charity fund. It didn't add up. She didn't know what Charles was playing at, but she'd go back for Emma, not for him. Maya touched her arm, a silent question. Latanya nodded, her lips curving slightly, a vow to her daughter and herself. She'd face this fight head-on. Charles stepped back, his hand still in his pocket, the note crinkling under his fingers. He'd found her, but the weight of her words and Emma's cries pressed harder than ever. Something bigger was stirring, something tied to that scrap of paper, and he wasn't ready for what it might unleash. Keep your head up, Jamal. Latonya Brooks's voice cut through the chatter of Harlem's community center, sharp and warm, a beacon in the crowded room. Her hands clapped, steady as a metronome, her eyes bright with purpose. At 34, she stood in the heart of her world, her worn sneakers planted firm on the cracked linoleum, her apron swapped for a faded t-shirt. A dozen kids, faces lit with hope, gathered around her, their voices rising in a clumsy but earnest chorus of an old folk song she taught them. Her jaw was set, her lips curving into a faint smile, but her heart still carried the sting of Charles Wentworth's words, "You're nothing here," and Emma's desperate cries from the night before. Her fingers twitched, itching to hold the girl again, but she pushed the ache down, her focus locked on the children before her. "Sing it like you mean it," she called, her voice a blade of encouragement, slicing through their hesitation. Jamal, a lanky boy with a crooked grin, stumbled over the lyrics, but Latanya's nod kept him going, her gaze a lifeline. She moved through the room, her hands guiding a girl's pencil over a book, her shoulder brushing another's in a silent promise of strength. This was her fight, lifting kids who'd been told they were less, just like she'd been. Her chest tightened, her pulse steady but fierce, fueled by years of swallowing slurs and standing tall. A knock at the door broke her rhythm. Latanya's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as Miss Clara, the center's director, handed her a folded letter. "Came for you, Tanya," Clara said, her voice soft but urgent. Latanya's fingers closed around the paper, her heart skipping a beat. The handwriting was small, shaky, unmistakably Emma's. "Tanya, I miss your songs. Come back." A crayon heart framed the words, crude but heavy, pulling Latanya's breath short. Her teeth clenched, the ache in her chest flaring. Emma's face, tear-streaked, searching, flashed in her mind, a wound that hadn't closed since Charles's cruel dismissal. "You okay?" Clara asked, her hand grazing Latanya's arm. Latanya's lips pressed tight, her nod sharp. "I'm fine," she said, her voice low, steel-wrapped. But her fingers trembled as she tucked the letter into her pocket, the weight of Emma's words anchoring her resolve. She wouldn't let that girl's trust break, not like Charles had tried to break her. "Keep singing, kids," she said, her voice steady again. But her eyes burned, a fire kindled by duty. She turned back to the group, clapping to restart the song, her movements deliberate, a defiance against the memory of Charles's sneer. Jamal's voice cracked on a high note, and the kids laughed, the sound bright, unburdened. Latanya's smile flickered, real but strained, as she joined in, her own voice low and rich, carrying the folk song like a prayer. She wasn't just teaching them to sing, she was teaching them to stand, to be seen, to be heard. Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of purpose. She'd faced worse than Charles Wentworth. Years of doors slammed, jobs lost, names whispered behind her back. This center, these kids, were her proof. She wasn't nothing. She was everything to them. But Emma's letter burned in her pocket, a call she couldn't ignore. Latanya's hands stilled, her clap faltering as she pictured the girl alone in that cold mansion, her small hands reaching for a comfort Charles couldn't give. Her jaw tightened, her resolve hardening like iron. She'd go back, not for Charles, not for his half-hearted apology, but for Emma, for the girl who needed her song to sleep, who needed her to stay. "Miss Clara, I'm stepping out tomorrow," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the kids' chatter. "Got a little girl waiting." Clara's eyes softened, a knowing look. "You always do right by them, Tanya," she said. Latanya nodded, her lips curving, but her heart raced with a vow. She'd face Charles again, on her terms. The letter in her pocket was a spark, a reminder of why she fought. She'd return to that mansion, not as a maid, but as a shield for Emma. And somewhere in the shadows of that house, a secret tied to Northridge was waiting to be cracked open. "You don't own me!" Latanya Brooks' voice slashed through the tension, her eyes locked on Charles Wentworth like a hawk on prey. She stood in the doorway of the Atlanta mansion study, her arms crossed, her jaw tight enough to crack stone. Emma's letter, "Tanya, I miss your songs," burned in her pocket, fueling her resolve. At 34, her presence was a quiet storm, her worn sneakers planted firm, her heart pounding with the weight of Charles's half-hearted apology from Harlem. Charles leaned against his desk, his knuckles white, gripping the edge, his face a mix of guilt and defiance. "I'm trying to make this right," he said, his voice low, strained, like a man swallowing broken glass. "Name your price." Latonya's lips curled, a bitter edge to her smile. "Price?" she spat, her words sharp as a blade. "You think money buys back what you broke?" Her fingers twitched, itching to ball into fists, but she kept them steady, her gaze burning through him. Emma's cries from that night, raw, desperate, echoed in her mind, a fire stoking her defiance. "You called me nothing," she said, stepping closer, her voice a low growl. "You scared a child to prove your power. I'm here for Emma, not your wallet." Charles's eyes flickered, a crack in his armor. "I was wrong," he said, his voice tight, each word forced. "Emma's a mess without you. I see that now." LaTonia's chest tightened, her pulse hammering, but she didn't soften. Seeing's not enough, she snapped, cutting him off before he could spin more excuses. You don't get to snap your fingers and fix this. Emma needs a home, not a cold room. She needs respect, not your orders. And so do I. He opened his mouth, but LaTonia's raised hand stopped him cold. Don't, she said, her voice a whip. You listen now. I'll come back, but on my terms. Her eyes bored into his, unyielding. You fix Emma's room. Heat, blankets, toys. You treat me like a person, not a shadow you kick around. And you never ever talk to me like I'm less again. Charles's jaw clenched, his fingers digging into the desk, but he nodded, a sharp jerk of his head. Done, he said, the word heavy, a contract carved in shame. LaTonia's shoulders squared, her resolve ironclad, but her heart still raced, Emma's letter a weight against her thigh. She turned to leave, her hand brushing a stack of papers on a side table, knocking them to the floor. She knelt to pick them up, her fingers grazing a crumpled envelope half hidden under a ledger. Her breath caught as she saw the scrawled words, Northridge Consulting. 4M approved, VW. Her eyes narrowed, the name sparking a memory. The mysterious note from her pocket, the one Charles had questioned. Her pulse quickened, suspicion coiling in her gut. This wasn't random. It was a thread to something bigger. What's that? Charles's voice cut through, sharp, his eyes locked on the envelope in her hand. LaTonia's fingers tightened, her instincts screaming to guard it. Just your mess, she said, her voice calm but edged, slipping the envelope into her pocket. You should keep your papers in order. Charles stepped closer, his brow furrowing, but LaTonia's gaze held him back, a silent warning. She wasn't here to play his game, not yet. Later that night, LaTonia slipped into the kitchen, the envelope burning a hole in her mind. She dialed Mrs. Dorothy, the retired housekeeper who'd seen decades of Wentworth's secrets. Dorothy, it's me, she whispered, her voice low, urgent. Northridge Consulting. Ever heard of it? Dorothy's pause was heavy, her breath catching. Child, that's no cleaning company, she said, her voice a hushed blade. It's tied to the family's charity fund. Money moves through it, but it don't stay. You found something, didn't you? LaTonia's hand tightened around the phone, her heart pounding. An envelope, she said. 4 million, signed VW. Dorothy's voice dropped lower. Vincent Wentworth, Charles's cousin. Be careful, Tanya. He's got claws. LaTonia's jaw set, her resolve hardening like steel. She'd come back for Emma, but now she was stepping into a snake pit. Charles's apology was a start, but this envelope, this secret, was a door she couldn't unopen. Charles stood in the study, alone, his fingers brushing the spot where the envelope had been. LaTonia's terms echoed, respect, not orders, and the memory of her fierce gaze burned. He'd brought her back, but something else was coming with her. Something tied to Northridge, something he couldn't control. The air felt heavier now, like a storm about to break. Stay in your lane, Maid! Vincent Wentworth's voice lashed out like a blade, his eyes glinting with malice as he loomed over LaTonia Brooks in the mansion's dimly lit hallway. At 34, LaTonia stood her ground, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The crumpled envelope from Charles's study, Northridge Consulting, 4M approved, VW, burned in her pocket, its weight a silent accusation. Vincent, Charles's cousin and a board member of the Wentworth family's charity, leaned closer, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her faded apron. You're sniffing around things that don't concern you, he hissed, his breath hot, his words dripping with disdain. Keep it up, and you'll regret it. LaTonia's pulse hammered, her chest tight with defiance. Her fingers twitched, itching to shove the envelope in his face, but she held back, her eyes locked on his, sharp as flint. I'm here for Emma, she said, her voice low, cutting like steel. Not your secrets. Vincent's lips curled into a sneer, his finger jabbing the air an inch from her chest. Emma's not your kid, he snapped, cutting her off. You're the help. Stick to scrubbing floors or I'll make sure you're out on the street. Her heart pounded, a war drum fueled by years of swallowed slurs and sidelong glances. Vincent's words echoed Charles's from that night. You're nothing here, but Latanya's resolve was iron. Threaten me all you want, she said, stepping closer, her voice a blade. But I know what I found. Northridge, 4 million? Sounds like your mess. Vincent's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking his composure, but he masked it with a cold laugh. You're out of your depth, he said, his voice a venomous hiss. Keep digging, and you'll bury yourself. And that orphan. Latanya's fists tightened, nails biting into her palms, the sting grounding her against the urge to lash out. Emma's face, tear-streaked, clutching her in the storm, flashed in her mind, a fire stoking her courage. You don't scare me, she said, her voice steady, each word a deliberate strike. Hurt Emma, and you'll answer to more than me. Vincent's sneer faltered, his hand twitching as if to grab her, but Latonya's gaze held him frozen, a quiet storm of defiance. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing to slits. You think you're clever, he said, his voice low, dangerous. I run this family's charity. One call, and Emma's shelter loses its funding. You want that on your conscience? Latonya's breath caught, her pulse spiking, but she didn't flinch. Cut the funding, she said, her voice a whip. I'll still be here. Emma will still have me. Vincent's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists, but he didn't strike. He turned, his shoes clicking sharply as he stormed off, leaving a chill in his wake. Latanya stood rooted, her heart racing, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the fire of purpose. Vincent's threat was a blade at her throat, but she'd faced worse. Her fingers brushed the envelope in her pocket, its edges sharp against her skin. Northridge wasn't just a name, it was a secret, and Vincent's reaction proved it. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Emma's safety, her own future, and the truth about that 4 million were tangled together, a knot she'd have to cut. She slipped into the kitchen, her movements swift, deliberate, and dialed Mrs. Dorothy, the retired housekeeper who'd warned her about Vincent's claws. He knows I found something, Latonia whispered, her voice urgent, her eyes scanning the shadows. Northridge, he's scared. Dorothy's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and knowing. Vincent's been skimming for years, she said. That envelope's just the start. Watch your back, Tanya. Latonya's grip tightened on the phone, her resolve hardening like steel. She wasn't just fighting for Emma now. She was stepping into a war. Vincent's shadow lingered in the hallway, his parting words a venomous echo. You'll bury yourself. But Latanya wasn't backing down. The envelope in her pocket was a spark, and she was ready to ignite it. Somewhere in this house, a bigger truth was hiding, and she'd tear it open, no matter the cost. You're playing with fire, Mrs. Dorothy's voice hissed through the phone, sharp as a blade, as Latanya Brooks clutched the device in the mansion's darkened kitchen. At 34, her pulse pounded like a war drum, her fingers trembling around the crumpled envelope. Northridge Consulting. 4M approved. VW. Its ink a silent scream of secrets. Vincent Wentworth's threat from hours ago. You'll bury yourself. Clawed at her mind, but her jaw clenched tight, her resolve ironclad. Her eyes darted to the shadows, every creak of the house a warning. I'm not backing down, she whispered, her voice low, cutting. Vincent's hiding something big. I need to know what. Dorothy's sigh crackled, heavy with years of buried truths. Northridge is a ghost, she said. Money goes in, nothing comes out. Check Charles's files. Late at night. Be quick. Latonya's heart raced, her fingers tightening on the envelope. She slipped it back into her apron, her movements swift, deliberate. Emma's face, tear-streaked, clinging to her in the storm, flashed in her mind, a fire stoking her courage. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for that little girl, for Harlem, for every voice silenced by men like Vincent. Latonya waited until midnight, the mansion quiet, its halls heavy with secrets. She crept to Charles's study, her sneakers silent on the marble, her breath shallow. Her hands shook as she picked the lock, a skill learned from years of making do. But her eyes stayed sharp, scanning for danger. Inside the desk loomed, a fortress of polished wood. She rifled through papers, her fingers deft, her pulse spiking with every rustle. Invoices, memos, nothing damning, until she found a locked drawer. Her hairpin snapped it open, revealing a folder labeled Northridge Consulting. Her breath caught, her heart hammering. Inside were fake invoices, $4 million for consulting services, signed by Vincent Wentworth. "You're in over your head," a voice sneered, cold and venomous. LaTonya spun, her hand clutching the folder, her eyes locking on Vincent standing in the doorway. His tailored suit gleamed, his smirk a blade. "Put it down," he said, stepping closer, his voice a hiss. "Or I'll make sure Emma's shelter shuts tomorrow." LaTonya's teeth ground together, her nails biting into her palms. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice steady, a whip cracking back. "This money was for kids like her. You stole it." Vincent's eyes narrowed, his hand shooting out to snatch the folder. LaTonya jerked back, her body a coiled spring, dodging his grasp. "Touch me, and you'll regret it," she snapped, her voice a blade, her stance unyielding. Vincent's smirk twisted, his fingers twitching. "You're a nobody," he said, cutting her off. "You think you can take me down?" LaTonya's chest tightened, her fury boiling, but she held the folder like a shield. "I'm not alone," she said, her words sharp, deliberate. "And you're not untouchable." She bolted past him, her heart pounding, the folder clutched to her chest. Vincent's shout echoed, "You're done!" But she didn't stop, her feet flying down the hall. She reached the kitchen, her breath ragged, and dialed Jamal, a banker friend from Harlem who'd seen his share of shady deals. "Jamal, I got invoices," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Northridge. Fake. $4 million. Can you trace it?" Jamal's voice was steady, a lifeline. "Send me scans. I'll check the accounts. Stay safe, Tanya." She snapped photos with her phone, her hands trembling but precise, and sent them off, each click a defiance against Vincent's threat. The next day, LaTonya met Dorothy at a diner, the folder hidden in her bag. Dorothy's eyes widened at the invoices, her fingers tracing Vincent's signature. "He's been skimming for years," she said, her voice low, sharp. "But this is proof." LaTonya's jaw set, her resolve hardening. "We need more," she said. "Emails, bank records, something he can't deny." Dorothy nodded, her hands steady despite her age. "Charles has a server," she said. "Old files, deleted emails. I know a guy who can hack it." LaTonya's pulse quickened, a spark of hope flaring. "Do it," she said, her voice a command. Charles caught her later, his eyes shadowed with unease. "You're stirring trouble," he said, his voice low, not accusing, but wary. "Vincent's family. What's this about?" LaTonya's fingers brushed the folder in her bag, her heart racing. "Your charity's bleeding," she said, her voice cutting. $4 million gone. Ask your cousin." Charles's face paled, his hand twitching to his pocket. The note from that night, qui tout tien. Kiamtra Northridge, 4M. "Help me," she said, her eyes locking on his. "For Emma." He hesitated, then nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm in," he said, the words heavy, a vow. That night, LaTonya's phone buzzed. "Jamal. Accounts traced to an offshore shell," he said. "Vincent's name's all over it. I found an email, too. Deleted but recovered. He approved the transfers." LaTonya's breath caught, her fingers trembling with adrenaline. The net was tightening, but Vincent's claws were out. She glanced at Emma, asleep in her now warmed room, her small chest rising with each breath. LaTonya's resolve burned brighter than ever. She'd tear this house apart to protect her. Vincent's shadow loomed, but the truth was closer, and she was ready to strike. "It's a betrayal." LaTonya Brooks' voice sliced through the diner's hum, her eyes blazing as she slammed the recovered email printout onto the table. At 34, her hands shook, not from fear but from fury, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. Mrs. Dorothy, the retired housekeeper, sat across from her, her weathered fingers tracing Vincent Wentworth's name on the document, her face pale with shock. The email, pulled from a deleted server by Dorothy's hacker contact, was a bombshell. Vincent had greenlit $4 million in charity funds to Northridge Consulting, a shell company funneling cash to illegal real estate deals. LaTonya's pulse pounded, her heart a war drum. Emma's tear-streaked face flashing in her mind. This wasn't just theft. It was a knife in the back of Harlem's poorest. "They're stealing from kids," LaTanya said, her voice low, a blade cutting through the air. "Emma's shelter, my neighborhood. They're gutting us." Dorothy's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Vincent's been at it for years," she said, her voice sharp, bitter. "Charles didn't watch close enough. He's complicit, even if he didn't know." LaTonya's fingers tightened on the printout, her nails digging into the paper, the sting grounding her against the rage boiling in her chest. "Charles isn't clean," she said, her words a hiss. "But Vincent's the snake." Her mind raced, piecing together the invoices, the email, Jamal's bank traces. Northridge wasn't just a scam. It was a land grab. The funds, meant for orphan shelters and community programs, were bankrolling luxury condos on Harlem's edges, displacing families like hers. Her daughter Maya's school was on that land, her neighbors' homes, her fists balled, her knuckles whitening. "They're tearing us down to build their empire," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "And they used Emma's future to do it." Dorothy's hand gripped hers, steady but firm. "You've got proof now, Tanya," she said, her voice a lifeline. "But Vincent's dangerous. He'll crush you to keep this quiet." LaTonya's eyes burned, her resolve steel. "Let him try," she said, her voice a whip. "I'm not stopping." She pulled out her phone, her fingers swift, texting Charles. "Meet me, now." "We need to talk about Vincent." Her heart pounded, a vow to Emma driving her forward. She'd tear this lie apart for her. Charles arrived, his face drawn, his hand clutching the mysterious note. "Qui tu tiens? Kiem tra Northridge, 4M. "What did you find?" he demanded, his voice tight, his eyes searching hers. LaTonya slid the email across the table, her gaze unyielding. "Your cousin's a thief," she said, her words sharp, cutting. 4 million stolen. Harlem's land, Emma's shelter, gone for his condos. Charles's jaw dropped, his fingers trembling as he scanned the email. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking, a crack in his pride. "I trusted him." "Trust?" LaTonya snapped, her voice a blade. "You let him bleed your charity dry. You let him hurt her." Charles's face paled, his hands shaking, but LaTonya didn't relent. "We're exposing this," she said, her voice iron. "For Emma, for Harlem. You're with me or you're against me." Charles's eyes met hers, guilt and resolve warring within. "I'm with you," he said, his voice low, a vow carved in shame. LaTonya's chest tightened, her pulse racing. The truth was out. Vincent's betrayal, the stolen millions, the land grab. But the fight was just beginning. She'd exposed the snake, but he was still coiled, ready to strike. Dorothy's warning echoed. "He'll crush you." LaTonya's fingers brushed Emma's letter in her pocket, a spark of defiance. She'd burn this house of lies to the ground if it meant saving her girl. "You're a dead end, Maid." Vincent Wentworth's voice sliced like a razor, his eyes glinting with venom as he loomed over LaTonya Brooks in the Wentworth Mansion's packed dining hall. At 34, LaTonya stood defiant, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, her hands gripping a folder of damning invoices. Proof of Vincent's $4 million theft from the charity fund. The air crackled with tension, the gathered family and board members frozen, their eyes darting between her and Vincent. Her heart pounded, a war drum fueled by the truth she'd uncovered with Mrs. Dorothy and Charles. Vincent's land grab, stealing from Harlem's poor, from Emma's future. "You stole from kids," LaTonya said, her voice a blade, sharp and unyielding. "This ends now." Vincent's lips curled into a sneer, his hands slamming the table, cutting her off. "You're nobody," he spat, his words dripping with disdain. "A maid with delusions. You think these people care about your papers?" LaTonya's fingers tightened on the folder, her nails biting into the paper, the sting grounding her against the fury boiling in her chest. Emma's face, tear-streaked, clinging to her in the storm, flashed in her mind, a fire stoking her courage. "I'm somebody to her," she said, her voice low, cutting. "And these papers? They're your confession." The room gasped, murmurs erupting, but Vincent's laugh was cold, jagged. "You're out of your league," he said, stepping closer, his finger jabbing the air an inch from her face. Give me that folder, or you'll wish you'd stayed in the kitchen. Latonia's pulse spiked, her eyes locking on his, unyielding. Try me, she said, her voice a whip, her stance a challenge. The board members shifted, their whispers sharp, but Vincent's gaze burned, a predator sizing up prey. Before she could move, Vincent lunged, his hand snatching for the folder. Latonia jerked back, her body a coiled spring, dodging his grasp. Don't touch me, she snapped, her voice a blade, her heart racing. The room spun into chaos, gasps, shouts, chairs scraping. But Vincent's focus was a laser. You're done, he hissed, his hand grabbing her arm, his grip bruising. Latonia's teeth ground together, her free hand shoving him back, her strength fueled by years of swallowed rage. Let go, she said, her voice deadly calm, a storm ready to break. Vincent's smirk twisted, his other hand signaling to a security guard. Take her, he ordered, his voice ice. And the kid. Latonia's blood ran cold, her eyes darting to Emma, huddled in a corner, her small frame trembling. Leave her alone, Latonia roared, breaking free, her arms swinging to shield the girl. But Vincent's guard was faster, grabbing Emma's wrist, dragging her toward a side door. The girl's scream pierced the air, a raw, desperate cry. Tanya! Latonia's heart shattered, her body surging forward, but Vincent blocked her path, his bulk a wall. You're finished, Vincent said, his voice a venomous hiss, shoving her toward the door. Both of you! Latonia's fist balled, her nails cutting into her palms, but she didn't fight back. Not yet. She stumbled into a cold, unheated storage room, the door slamming shut behind her and Emma. The lock clicked, a sound like a guillotine. Emma's sobs echoed, her small hands clutching Latonia's blouse, her face buried in her chest. Tanya, I'm scared, she whispered, her voice breaking. Latonia's chest tightened, her pulse hammering, but she knelt, pulling Emma close, her arms a shield. I'm here, baby girl, she said, her voice soft but iron, her hands steady despite the fear clawing her gut. She sang a folk song, low and rich, the notes a lifeline, calming Emma's trembling. Her mind raced, her fingers brushing an old phone in her pocket, a burner Dorothy had given her. Stay quiet, she whispered, her eyes scanning the dark, her heart pounding. She texted Dorothy. Locked in storage. Emma with me. Vincent, help. Vincent's threat echoed. You're done. But Latonia's resolve burned hotter. Her fingers tightened around Emma, her song unbroken, a vow to fight. The folder was gone, snatched by Vincent, but the truth was in her hands, her heart, her voice. Dorothy would come. Charles would know. And Vincent would pay. The locked door was a cage, but Latonia was no prey. She was a lion, and her roar was coming. Break it down! Charles Wentworth's voice roared like a gunshot, his shoulders slamming against the locked storage room door. Inside, Latonia Brooks crouched, her arms wrapped tight around Emma, the 6-year-old orphan's sobs muffled against her chest. At 34, Latonia's heart pounded, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached, her fingers still clutching the burner phone where she'd texted Mrs. Dorothy for help. Vincent Wentworth's venomous words, "You're done," rang in her ears, but her pulse burned with defiance, her song to Emma unbroken despite the cold biting her skin. The door shuddered, wood splintering, as Charles's desperation cracked through. "Tanya, hold on," he shouted, his voice raw, a vow forged in guilt. Latonia's eyes darted, sharp as flint, scanning the dark for a way out. "Stay with me, baby girl," she whispered, her voice a lifeline, steady despite the fear clawing her gut. Emma's small hands gripped her blouse, nails digging in, her whimpers softening under Latonia's folk song. The door burst open, Charles stumbling in, his face pale, his hands trembling. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tight, his eyes locking on Emma's tear-streaked face. Latonia nodded, her jaw set, but her heart raced. "Vincent took the folder," she said, her words sharp, cutting. "We need more proof. Now." Charles's fist balled, his knuckles whitening. "I trusted him," he said, his voice breaking, a confession heavy with shame. Latonia stood, pulling Emma close, her eyes burning into his. "Trust won't save us," she snapped, her voice a whip. Evidence will. Where's his office? Charles hesitated, then nodded, his resolve hardening. Upstairs, he said. Follow me. Latonia's fingers tightened around Emma's hand, her pulse spiking as she handed the girl to Dorothy, who'd arrived, breathless, her eyes fierce. Keep her safe, Latonia said, her voice iron. Dorothy's nod was a promise, her arms wrapping around Emma like a shield. Latonia and Charles moved like shadows, their steps swift, silent through the mansion's halls. Vincent's office loomed, a fortress of secrets. Latonia's hairpin snapped the lock, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. Inside, papers littered the desk, but her eyes zeroed in on a sleek laptop, its screen dark. Check it, she said, her voice low, urgent. Charles's fingers flew, typing passwords he shouldn't have known, his face a mask of guilt. He used my codes, he muttered, his voice bitter. I was blind. The screen lit up, revealing a hidden folder. Northridge transfers. Latonia's breath caught, her heart hammering as she clicked through. Bank records, emails, a ledger detailing $4 million siphoned from the charity to offshore accounts, signed by Vincent. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes were steel, scanning every line. This is it, she said, her voice ablade. He's done. But Charles's hand froze, his face paling as he opened an audio file. Vincent's voice crackled through. The Harlem land's ours. The charity's a front. Charles won't suspect a thing. Latonia's chest tightened, her fury boiling. He played you, she said, her words cutting, unyielding. And he played Harlem. Charles's jaw clenched, his hands shaking with rage. I'll end this, he said, his voice low, a vow carved in fire. Latonia's eyes narrowed, her resolve ironclad. We end it together, she said, her voice a whip. She copied the files to a USB, her movements swift, precise, but her heart pounded, Vincent's threat echoing. You'll bury yourself. She wouldn't let him win. We need a platform, she said, her eyes locking on Charles. The charity gala. Tomorrow. Everyone will be there. Charles nodded, his face grim. I'll get you in, he said, his voice steady now. A partner, not a boss. Latonia's fingers closed around the USB, its weight a weapon, but a creak in the hall stopped her cold, her pulse spiking. He's watching, she whispered, her eyes darting to the door. Charles's hand gripped her arm, a silent signal to move. They slipped out, the USB hidden in her apron, her heart racing as Vincent's shadow loomed closer. At the diner, Latonia met Jamal, her banker friend, his eyes wide as she handed him the USB. This is dynamite, he said, his voice low, urgent. Offshore accounts, Vincent's voice. It's airtight. Latonia's jaw set, her fingers trembling with adrenaline. Get it to the press, she said, her voice a command. But quietly. Vincent can't know. Jamal nodded, his hands steady, a soldier in her fight. Dorothy joined them, her eyes fierce. You're close, Tanya, she said, her voice sharp. But he'll strike back. Latonia's chest tightened, her resolve burning brighter. Emma's letter, I miss your songs, was a fire in her heart, driving her forward. She'd escaped Vincent's cage, but the fight wasn't over. The gala loomed, a battlefield where she'd face him, armed with the truth. Vincent thought he'd buried her, but she was rising, and the USB in her pocket was a ticking bomb, ready to detonate. You're a thief! Latonia Brooks's voice cut through the charity gala's hum like a gunshot, her eyes blazing as she stood on the stage, clutching the USB drive. At 34, her hands trembled with fury, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, her faded dress a stark contrast to the glittering crowd. The Atlanta elite, board members, donors, Wentworth allies, froze, their gas sharp, their eyes locked on her. The USB burned in her palm, loaded with Vincent Wentworth's crimes. $4 million stolen from the charity, funneled through Northridge Consulting to fund illegal land grabs. Emma's tear-streaked face fueled her fire, her heart pounding like a war drum. You betrayed Harlem, she said, her voice a blade, slicing through Vincent's smug facade. You betrayed her. Vincent, seated at the head table, shot to his feet, his face red, his sneer a mask of rage. You're a liar, he roared, his finger jabbing the air, cutting her off. A maid with a grudge. Sit down, the crowd murmured, their whispers sharp. But Latanya's stance was iron, her eyes locked on his. I'm not your maid tonight, she said, her voice low, cutting like steel. I'm the truth. She plugged the USB into the projector, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. The screen lit up. Invoices, bank records, Vincent's email approving the $4 million transfer. The room erupted, gasps turning to shouts. But Latanya's voice rose, a whip cracking through the chaos. You stole from kids like Emma, she said, her words sharp, unyielding. You took their homes, their hope, for your condos. She clicked to the audio file, and Vincent's voice boomed. The Harlem land's ours. The charity's a front. The crowd stilled, their eyes wide, the truth a hammer shattering Vincent's lies. His face paled, his hands shaking, but he lunged forward, his voice a hiss. You'll pay for this, he spat, his arm swinging to grab the USB. Latanya stepped back, her body a coiled spring, dodging his grasp. You're done, she said, her voice a blade, her eyes burning with defiance. Charles Wentworth stood from the crowd, his face grim, his hands clenched. Enough, Vincent, he said, his voice low, heavy with shame. I trusted you. I was wrong. The crowd gasped again, their whispers a storm, but Charles's gaze locked on Latanya, a silent vow. Show them everything, he said, his words steady. A partner now, not a boss. Latanya clicked through the files, her heart racing, each slide a nail in Vincent's coffin. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, forged signatures, Harlem land deeds tied to Northridge. This was for shelters, she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. For kids like Emma, who you left in the cold. The crowd's murmurs turned to outrage, eyes turning to Vincent, who shrank under their weight. It's a setup, he shouted, his voice cracking, but the evidence was ironclad, his lies crumbling like ash. A board member stood, her face stern. Step down, Vincent, she said, her voice a gavel. Now! Vincent's eyes darted, his smirk gone, his hands trembling as security flanked him. You can't do this, he snarled, but Latanya's gaze held him pinned, a lion facing a snake. You did this to yourself, she said, her voice a whip, her stance unyielding. The crowd's outrage swelled, a tide turning against him. Security grabbed his arms, his shouts fading as they dragged him out, the door slamming shut like a coffin lid. Latanya stood tall, her chest heaving, her fingers still gripping the USB. The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of truth. Charles stepped beside her, his head bowed, his voice low. I should have seen it, he said, his words raw. Thank you. Latonya's eyes softened, but her resolve burned. This isn't over, she said, her voice steady, a vow. Emma's future, Harlem's homes. They'd fight on. The crowd's eyes stayed on her, a maid who'd become their mirror, reflecting a truth they couldn't ignore. The gala was a battlefield, and Latanya had won, but the war wasn't done. You're finished! Latanya Brooks' voice slashed like a blade, her eyes locked on Vincent Wentworth as he stood, handcuffed, in the courtroom's harsh glare. At 34, her jaw clenched tight, her fists balled, her heart pounding with a fire forged from Emma's tears and Harlem's stolen hopes. The judge's gavel slammed, a thunderclap sealing Vincent's fate, guilty of embezzling $4 million from the Wentworth charity through Northridge Consulting. Latonya's chest heaved, her pulse a war drum, the memory of Vincent's sneer. You're nobody, fueling her resolve. You stole from kids, she said, her voice low, cutting, as Vincent's head bowed, his smirk gone. Now you pay. The courtroom buzzed, reporters' pens scratching, but Latanya's gaze stayed iron, unyielding. Vincent's eyes darted, his hands trembling in cuffs, his voice a hiss. You think this changes anything? He spat, but the judge cut him off, her voice a gavel. 7 years, she said, and restitution. Latonya's lips pressed tight, her heart swelling with a hard-won victory. The crowd's murmurs rose, a tide of justice, as Vincent was led away, his tailored suit now a shackle. Charles Wentworth stood beside her, his face grim, his hands clenched. "I let this happen," he said, his voice raw, heavy with shame. "I didn't see." Latanya's eyes flicked to him, sharp but softening. "You see now," she said, her words a whip, but laced with hope. "Make it right." Charles nodded, his jaw tight, a vow carved in guilt. The court papers confirmed. $3 million recovered, frozen accounts cracked open, Harlem's shelters funded again. Latonya's fingers brushed Emma's letter in her pocket. "I miss your songs." A spark of purpose. She stepped out, her sneakers firm on the courthouse steps, where Harlem's community waited, their cheers a roar. "You did it, Tanya!" A voice shouted. Jamal, her banker friend, his grin wide. Latonya's chest tightened, her smile fierce but strained. "Not alone," she said, her voice steady, a nod to Dorothy, to Charles, to every voice she'd lifted. Vincent's crimes were buried, the truth laid bare, but Latanya's fight was far from over. The courthouse doors swung shut, Vincent's shadow gone, but Latanya's fire burned brighter. She'd torn down his lies, but the real work, rebuilding, healing, lay ahead, and she was ready to lead. "I failed you." Charles Wentworth's voice cracked like a whip, his eyes locked on Latonya Brooks as he stood in the newly opened Harlem Community Center, his hands trembling with shame. At 34, Latanya's jaw clenched, her pulse steady but fierce, her faded jeans and t-shirt a stark contrast to his tailored suit. Vincent Wentworth's conviction, $4 million stolen, Harlem's hopes gutted, still burned in her mind, but her heart pounded for Emma, for her daughter Maya, for every family Vincent's greed had crushed. "Words don't fix this," she said, her voice a blade, sharp and unyielding. "Actions do." Charles's fists balled, his knuckles whitening as he stepped closer, his face raw with guilt. "I'm giving you everything," he said, his words heavy, a vow carved in fire. "Name it." Latonya's eyes narrowed, her fingers twitching, itching to push back, but her resolve was iron. "Harlem needs a heart," she said, her voice low, cutting. "Not your pity. Build something real. Shelters, jobs, schools. For Emma. For us." Charles nodded, his throat tight, his eyes burning with a promise he'd failed to keep before. He handed her a folder, his hands unsteady. "Hearth and Harmony," he said, his voice rough. "Your vision. My money. No strings." Latonya's breath caught, her fingers gripping the folder, its pages detailing a new foundation. A Harlem Center for Orphans and Black Workers, funded by the recovered $3 million from Vincent's theft. Her heart raced, a spark of hope flaring, but her eyes stayed sharp, searching for a catch. "This isn't yours to brand," she said, her voice a whip. "It's mine. It's theirs." Charles's head bowed, a silent surrender. "It's yours," he said, his words a contract. "Lead it." Latonya's chest tightened, her pulse hammering as she opened the folder. Blueprints for a community hub, classrooms, a daycare, job training stared back, her dream made real. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but from purpose. Emma's letter. "I miss your songs," a fire in her pocket. "This is for them," she said, her voice steady, a vow to Harlem. "Not your redemption." Charles nodded, his jaw set, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm learning," he said, his words raw, a man remade. The next day, Latonya stood at the center's ribbon cutting, her hands steady as she clipped the tape, her eyes fierce with pride. Harlem's faces, mothers, kids, workers, cheered, their voices a roar of hope. She spoke, her voice clear, cutting through the crowd's hum. "This is Hearth and Harmony," she said, her words a blade of truth. "A place to stand, to sing, to rise." Maya, her daughter, stood beside her, her grin wide, her hand squeezing Latonya's. "You did it, Mama," she whispered, her voice a spark. Latonya's lips curved, her heart swelling, but her eyes stayed sharp, a lion guarding her pride. Charles stepped forward, his presence quieter now, his suit less a shield. "I was blind," he said to the crowd, his voice breaking, his hands open. "Latonya showed me. This center's her fight, not mine." The crowd's cheers swelled, their hands clapping, a tide of respect. Latonya's gaze softened, a flicker of trust, but her voice cut through. It's our fight, she said, her words steady, a call to unity. For every kid like Emma, every family pushed out. She turned to the center's doors, her hands pushing them open, revealing a room filled with books, toys, and warmth. Mothers enrolled for job training. Kids ran to the play area, their laughter a song. Latonia's chest heaved, her heart racing with a hope she hadn't dared feel. She'd fought Vincent's lies, faced his threats, and now stood here, building a future. Charles followed, his steps hesitant, his eyes on her. "What's next?" he asked, his voice low. A student now, not a boss. "Keep listening," Latonia said, her voice a whip but laced with purpose. "We rebuild, one family at a time." She handed him a flyer for Hearth and Harmony, her handwriting bold. "We stand, we sing." Charles's fingers closed around it, his nod firm, a vow to stay. The crowd's energy pulsed, Harlem's heart beating stronger. Latonia's fire hadn't dimmed, it had spread, and she'd lead it forward, unyielding, unbreakable. The center's doors stayed open, a beacon in Harlem, but Latonia's gaze was already on the horizon, where more battles waited and more songs would rise. "You're home now," Latonia Brooks' voice rang out, sharp and warm, her arms wrapping tight around Emma, as the 6-year-old orphan clung to her, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. At 34, Latonia stood in the doorway of a modest Atlanta home, her jaw set with pride, her heart pounding like a drum of triumph. Her faded jeans and t-shirt were a badge of her fight, her eyes blazing with a fire forged through battles against Vincent Wentworth's $4 million theft and Harlem's stolen hopes. The new adoptive parents, a young couple with kind eyes, stood behind, their hands clasped, their faces glowing with gratitude. Latonia's chest heaved, her pulse steady but fierce. Emma's letter, "I miss your songs," still a spark in her pocket. "Stay with me, Tanya." Emma's small voice cut through, her hands gripping Latonia's blouse, nails digging in like anchors. Latonia knelt, her eyes softening, her fingers brushing the girl's cheek. "I'm always here, baby girl," she said, her voice a lifeline, low and rich, like the folk songs she sang in the storm. "You got a new home, but I'm your family too." Emma's eyes sparkled, her nod fierce, a child's oath. Latonia's heart swelled, her throat tight, but her smile was iron, a vow unbroken. Charles Wentworth stood a step back, his suit loosened, his hands unsteady but open. "You made this happen," he said, his voice raw, heavy with a guilt he'd carried since his cruel words. "You're nothing here." Latonia's gaze flicked to him, sharp but warm, a lion who'd tamed a storm. "We made it happen," she said, her words a whip laced with unity. "You learned to listen." Charles's jaw clenched, his nod firm, his eyes burning with a promise remade. He'd funded Hearth and Harmony, Latonia's center, but this moment, Emma's new beginning, was her victory, not his. The couple ushered Emma inside, her laughter a bright note as she ran to explore her new room. Latonia stood, her hands trembling, not from fear but from purpose. She turned to Charles, her eyes steady. "This is just the start," she said, her voice cutting, a call to keep fighting. "Harlem's still bleeding. We don't stop." Charles's fingers twitched, his face a map of shame and resolve. "I'm in," he said, his words a vow. No longer a tycoon, but a partner. Latonia's lips curved, a spark of trust, but her fire burned bright, unyielding. Later at Hearth and Harmony, the center pulsed with life. Kids ran through the playroom, their laughter a chorus, while mothers signed up for job training, their hands steady with hope. Latonia stood at the heart of it, her voice rising in a folk song, rich and defiant, the same one that calmed Emma in the storm. Maya, her 15-year-old daughter, joined in, her voice blending with her mother's, a harmony of strength. The crowd, Harlem's families, workers, allies, swayed, their claps a rhythm of rebirth. Latonia's chest tightened, her heart racing with a pride she'd fought for, her eyes scanning faces she'd lifted from the shadows. Mrs. Dorothy, the retired housekeeper, slipped her a folded note, her eyes fierce but soft. "Found this in the old mansion?" she whispered, her voice a blade of wisdom. Latonia unfolded it, her breath catching. In Dorothy's careful script, family is where you stay, not where you command. Her fingers trembled, the words a mirror of her fight, staying for Emma, for Harlem, for herself. You taught me that, she said to Dorothy, her voice low. A vow. Dorothy's hand squeezed hers, a lifeline across generations. You taught us all, she said, her words sharp, true. Charles stepped forward, his voice unsteady but clear. I'm learning your song, he said, his attempt at the folk tune clumsy but earnest. Drawing a laugh from Maya, Latonia's eyes softened, her smile real now, a bridge built from battles won. Keep practicing, she said, her voice a whip but warm. It's not about the notes, it's about staying. Charles nodded, his hands open, his eyes on Emma, now playing with other kids, her laughter a beacon. He'd been blind, but Latonia's fire had opened his eyes, and he'd stay to see it through. The center's wall held a sign, Latonia's handwriting bold. We stand, we sing, stay and rise. Families pinned notes beside it, requests for beds, jobs, hope, each one a victory. Latonia's heart pounded, her resolve a flame that wouldn't die. She'd faced Vincent's claws, Charles's shame, a system that called her nothing. Now she was everything. To Emma, to Maya, to Harlem. This is home, she said to the crowd, her voice clear, cutting. Not a place, but a fight we share. Charles handed her a small box, his fingers hesitant. For you, he said, his voice low, no fanfare. Inside, a pendant shaped like a heart, engraved with hearth and harmony. Not a gift, he said, his words raw. A reminder. Latonia's fingers closed around it, her eyes steady. I don't need reminders, she said, her voice a blade, but soft. I live it. She pinned the pendant to her shirt, her heart racing, a symbol of her fight, not his redemption. The crowd sang on, their voices a tide, Harlem's heartbeat growing stronger. Latonia stood among them, her hands steady, her eyes on the future. Emma ran to her, hugging her legs, her whisper clear. You're my family, Tanya. Latonia knelt, her arms wrapping tight, her song rising again. Charles watched, his hand on Maya's shoulder, a quiet triangle of trust in a world they'd change. The lesson burned clear. Family isn't blood. It's who stays, who fights, who sings through the storm. Latonia's fire had lit a path, and Harlem walked it with her, their voices rising, unbroken, unstoppable. This story of Latonia Brooks teaches us that family isn't just blood. It's the people who stay, fight, and sing through the storm for those who need them most. Her courage turned a Maid song into a movement, proving that small acts of defiance can rebuild communities and reclaim justice. What would you stay for? Share your thoughts, your stories in the comments below. Let's lift each other up. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Hit like, share with friends, and we'll see you in the next story.